So welcome everybody to this July 22nd Regulatory Priorities webinar and it's an open webinar from NIA, so members and non-members are welcome to take part. We had a really high registration number for this webinar today with over 150 registrations, which is both exciting and terrifying. So we have to ask that everybody stays on mute for the webinar and so that we can ensure the audio quality for everybody. We will be recording the webinar and putting it on YouTube, and we will also be following up with all registered delegates so that they can receive the slides and the recording. I will also include links to any other opportunities that we currently now have open for you. So without further ado, we will get started with a quick overview of the agenda today. We've got quite a lot of topics to fit in this afternoon, so we don't go into them in too much detail, which is also slightly a relief for me because I can see in our list some highly knowledgeable people attending. So I will stop talking when my knowledge runs out. So that should be fine. We'll start off with a quick welcome and introduction to NIA because as of course there is no such thing as a free lunch. So you're going to hear a little bit about what we do and what we have coming up in the pipeline. We'll then move to our regulatory items. And you can see we've got a lot of things from the European Union. The dreaded B word makes its entry with a small Brexit update. We'll then cross over to the US before taking a step back and having a global look at what's going on. And then finally, we've got a small update on our project-based support for regulatory priorities, and that primarily takes the shape of the Nano Harmony project. As I said, we had a lot of registrations for the webinar today, so we are not able to go to our usual member-only discussion session at the end. But what we will do is close this webinar, and then some members can join us in a separate webinar, which I sent the information to you for yesterday. So let's get started, as I'm sure you have many things to do on this sunny Wednesday afternoon. So this is starting the quick introduction to NIA and what we do. So we work in a number of areas and they all have reasons why we are active in those areas. The commercial development of nanomaterials is still a growing and maturing aspect of nanomaterials. It is not a mature commercial sector by any stretch of the imagination. So there's lots of different work for NIA to do that enables individual companies and the consumers as a whole to benefit from nanomaterials. One of the core reasons that we operate, and indeed the founding principles that started NIA in the first place, are understanding and helping to develop the regulatory pathways to market, because these are growing increasingly complex as more nano-specific information comes out. We also work very hard to build confidence in nanomaterials, because of course, you need to persuade people that you need to demonstrate what benefits nanomaterials will have within products and processes and how they can be safely used throughout their whole life cycle. And nanomaterials, of course, the only thing that holds them together is really their size. They are different substances applied into different materials, in different products, in different sectors and in different countries. So there's a lot to learn across different sectors and material types. And so we work really hard to bring our members together and showcase how nanotechnology and nanomaterials can move and benefit across sectors. And finally, as we really look towards a more circular economy with sustainable development, and in particular for the European Union, the emergence of the Green Deal, nanomaterials have to show their role within a sustainable economic development, both in their ability to contribute towards greener products and processes, but also that they themselves can be safely used and recycled and disposed of throughout the entire life cycle of a product. So it's very important to work across all of these four messages, and hopefully we manage to do that within NIA. So our three main areas of activity are, as we've mentioned already, helping to support the development of a robust regulatory framework. And that includes a lot of interaction with governments at national and EU level, and indeed all over the governments all over the world, and also with the regulatory agencies and the implementation mechanisms that are developed to enable regulations to work well. And so we have a lot of industrial interaction as well to try and build accessible and feasible regulatory frameworks. We also undertake a lot of business and scientific networking for our members because, of course, it's a very small world, particularly in nano, and there's always somewhere else you could be going to look at how your products could be developed for application into new products and processes. So it's extremely interesting to understand how member products can be applied outside their original applications. And finally, we work with partners all around the world to build a robust commercial nanotechnology ecosystem. And this is really where a lot of our projects from within the EU come into play to help look at all aspects of building successful commercial nanomaterials. And that goes right back to early stage R&D through to the infrastructures needed to help early stage innovations find market access. This is a tiny snapshot of our members, who are a very friendly and diverse bunch. Our commercial producers and users are part of NIA for lots of different reasons. A lot of our smaller members would really like to gain, they need the regulatory expertise that they don't keep in-house, and they also appreciate the critical mass and visibility that we can give them. And our larger members, such as BASF and Solvay, are real pillars of the regulatory development process, bringing, as they do, many years of strategic knowledge into the game. And so they are incredibly valuable parts of the nanomaterials community. Our products and services members play a critical role. And this has always been something that I push very strongly, in that a successful sector will only be successful if it has strong service providers within it, so that you can go with it, so a product can make its way to market cost effectively and quickly. And that's absolutely critical. And so this is where the service providers come into play. They bring expertise that you do not have in-house, and they are a core part of the economic maturation of the sector. And finally, we have our research members and our other association members. And these guys, again, are often the absolute interface between research and industry. And so we go to those members when we're looking at next generation materials and next generation safety assessments, so that we can smooth the way into commercial development as much as possible. So all our members work together, and we do make them work very hard, I'm afraid to say. So what's coming up in the NIA pipeline? Of course, this has been a very surreal 2020 so far, and all of us have been locked down for at least 3 to 4 months now, and we're starting slowly to emerge, although of course with a great deal of caution for the second wave that we see starting to develop in lots of different countries. This brings with it a lot of different working practices, which are likely to become a lot more permanent. And so NIA is adapting to that to try and keep serving our members and the wider nanotechnology community. We recognise, of course, that there is going to be a longer-term reduction in face-to-face contact, with trade shows and conferences having completely disappeared this year and unlikely to come back in the full structure that they have had previously. So we're definitely going to look to increase member support to allow them to network and partner and promote themselves, making more use of the interactions that we can bring for them. So that's going to include the development of more online services for partnering and networking. We are also increasing our regulatory support to members, and particularly as we gain a lot of progress through test guidelines and guidance documents becoming more nano-specific now. And so we're going to produce quarterly reports for our members on sort of global standards efforts and how industry in particular can become involved in ensuring that they are as nano-appropriate as possible. We have several position papers in the pipeline this year as well. The first one is really aiming towards high-level policy at the moment, which is looking at nanomaterials within the terminology of advanced materials. We know that this is a big terminology change from the European Commission. It's also being looked at the OECD, and it's really important that nanomaterials producers and researchers ensure that as advanced materials moves from sort of high-level headline into something that may well influence regulatory frameworks, that we have everything completely accurate and appropriate for nanomaterials. Our second position paper, and you'll see a little bit more about this in the presentation today, is really around nanomaterials terminology. Now that we have evolved into use of nanoforms as one of the primary terminologies. So I think that's a really important position paper to work on, because a lot of publications and articles that we're seeing still refer to nanomaterials in a very generic way, rather than addressing the substantial conversation you get across a substance now that we have nanoforms emerging in a sort of regulatory binding fashion. And finally, we've got some nice open events coming up later this year for after your summer holidays. We have a very interesting webinar, which I would recommend that you sign up for on the 16th of September, which is part of the Nano Harmony project, which is taking a step back and looking at how you develop test guidelines that are appropriate for nanomaterials. And I can tell you now that this is a very popular webinar with almost 400 registrations already. So we're expecting it to be an absolute sellout by the time we get to September. We also have our online annual symposium coming up in October. So that's switched from face-to-face to online. And we look forward to welcoming all of our members and a number of external organisations into that. And then also in the final strand there, we have, as ever, we have our Nano in Action and our Nano in Business webinars with topics coming up in the autumn for looking at the interface between research and industry and also addressing occupational exposure in the laboratory. So that brings to the end of my little sales pitch about NIA. So I will close with the don't forget to get involved with us slide, which lots of you have probably seen before. So our fastest way to stay in touch on a daily basis is with our LinkedIn profile, which we update 3 or 4 times a week. We have a newsletter coming out tomorrow, so don't forget to sign up to our newsletter. And this slide is hyperlinked to the newsletter sign up, where you'll be able to get a lot of the news articles that underpin the content of this webinar. And of course, I would say this, but you should definitely become a member if you're not one already, because it's a very active community and we're really pleased to see the level of industrial involvement in our, particularly our regulatory and our test guidelines and guidance document work these days. So it's a really great way of becoming directly involved in shaping your own community. And because this is a very surreal year, we have a membership offer that would take you to the end of this year. Just pay for 4 months until the end of 2020, and you can start your membership benefits right now. And that gives you a really nice opportunity to assess how useful membership is, and then you can join for a full year in 2021. So if you would like to, you'll be able to click on this link when I send the slides out. Just pop your email address into the doodle that is in the Pick a Time link, and we will set up a call with you over the summer, and you can introduce your priorities and how you might possibly fit into NIA as an active member. So I'm going to switch over to the first of our regulatory priorities now, and this is just a quick reminder that if everybody could make sure that they are on mute, that would be really great. Thank you very much. So I will move my control panel out the way and get to work. So our first set of regulatory priorities to look at really fit within the European Union, and it's been very busy there since the introduction of the REACH Annex amendments to reflect the use of nanoforms. And one of the best ways to keep in touch with progress of the implementation of these changes is through the CARACAL meetings, 2 of which have taken place since January the 1st, and where ECHA has been reporting on the overall progress on the submission of nanoform-specific dossiers. So we had an initial presentation from ECHA into CARACAL at the end of March, where it showed that they'd had 86 submissions for 34 substances with nanoforms. And that was actually far fewer than they had been anticipating, as they'd done a little market research from a number of different places and had predicted anywhere between 200 and 2,000 different substances to be registered. We also saw at that point quite a high level of failed completeness checks, but that was also for a wide number of reasons. And often those reasons were quite basic administrative reasons. Some of the key areas of problems with the completeness check were around the use of language in the justification of the nanoform set. It was not specific enough to the set, or the sets were too broad, or they were missing a lead dossier, which was somewhat inevitable given the late publication of the guidance before the REACH Annex update came into force. There was a second report in June from ECHA into the next CARACAL meeting, where they let us know that a further 37 submissions have been received, and so the substances now covered are 54. And the technical completeness has been improved, which is really good, and I think reflects the both parties getting to grips with the language and the protocols required. And what we see now, and from the reporting into CARACAL, in that one of the main areas of issue is still around the justification of nanoform sets. And we're hoping to work with ECHA and a number of other organisations to try and improve this, because I think it's a learning process for everybody. Earlier this year with members, we did share a webinar with EFSA where they are developing a web guidance platform for nanoform justification for your set. And we're hoping that this will be more widely available later this year. I will certainly keep everybody posted, because that would really help applicants get the language right and get the justification levels right. So the CARACAL documents are all available in the public domain, and you will see the Circa BC link is highlighted here. And so you'll be able to click through to Circa BC and look at the CARACAL documents after this webinar. You do need a profile, but it is free to access. So I would recommend going to look at that. So staying with the REACH Annex updates, we see a new update for Annex 2, which is the safety data sheets to reflect the revised terminology for nanoforms. And we anticipated this to come. And so it's important that companies start to look at the safety data sheet. Indeed, we get a lot of feedback from other organisations, particularly users of nanomaterials, that the safety data sheets did not contain enough or indeed any information around materials at the nanoscale. And so it didn't really help with the confidence in using nanomaterials, particularly for the first time in your product. So hopefully these changes required in the safety data sheets will give more confidence for people considering to use nanomaterials, because they will have this information available to them. So the safety data sheets now have to be amended in a number of ways, although the deadline to do this is not until 2022. So there are various basic key things to look at. So of course, we're going to use the term nanoform throughout the safety data sheets where you have materials at the nanoscale. And you see two different types of change requested here. So where you have a nanoform that is already registered, you will talk about the particle characteristics that are already described in Annex 6. Where you have substances that are not registered or addressed, you will include particle characteristics which impact the safety of the mixture. So those are the two key differentiators for companies to look at when they're generating information for safety data sheets. And that's the same with both mixtures and substances. You also have a section where you look at section 9, which is information on basic physical and chemical properties. And you will have to include information on solubility, so the dissolution rate, the partition coefficient, and particle characteristics. And of course, if you have your nanoforms already registered, you can refer back to those. If not, you will provide specific information to your nanomaterial. So hopefully that will be an interesting thing to do with members as we go forward, looking at the correct language to use in safety data sheets and the impact on people using those safety data sheets to give them greater confidence in using nanomaterials. Staying with Europe, we move over to food, and EFSA has launched a public consultation for small particles in food and feed beyond the engineered nanomaterial definition. So this is something that we have been aware of an issue with for a little while, because EFSA gives itself the right to request additional nanospecific information where they feel there may be nano-like properties of a material, even if it's above the legal definition of an engineered nanomaterial at 100 nanometers. So there was some grey areas for nanomaterials at the top end of the definition of an engineered nanomaterial. So this consultation starts to address that, and it's looking at enabling organisations to assess the presence of a fraction of small particles in their foodstuff. So this is beyond the definition of an engineered nanomaterial. And the links you will see here will take you straight to the full consultation information. So I would very much recommend that people click there and have a look. And I wanted to have a little bit more of a look at some of the key aspects of this consultation, because this is very important to enable industrial confidence in developing nanomaterials for use in food and food contact materials. So the appraisal criteria are in 3 sections. So you need to assess whether consumers will be exposed to particles. So they're looking at solubility and dissolution rates to help establish that. They're looking at supporting you to assess whether your material contains a fraction or consists of small particles. And finally, it supports you on the information to be presented from existing safety studies, because what they want to do is not go into further animal testing required. And the types of particles that you would typically find that may fall into these categories, as you see at the top of my slide, talk about particles which may be formed naturally or as byproducts in the production process. So these are not necessarily intentionally added materials at the start of the process. So moving on, the characterization of these small particles is required in all cases unless they can demonstrate that the material is fully dissolved. And for multi-constituent substances, the information should address each single constituent as well as the multi-component material. Moving on to the last thing I would like to cover, where you've got naturally derived materials, like for example here we've got biological origin or macromolecules such as enzymes or other proteins, you need to provide a justification of why the assessment of those particles is not required. So I think this is a much needed guidance development, and you can see the image here also, which gives you a little flow chart of which guidance to follow and apply into your own materials. So this has just come out, so NIA will work with members to be part of to submit a formal consultation response, and we look forward to having any feedback from people that would like to take part in that consultation. Staying with food, France will never be far away from any discussion about nanomaterials within food, and in a relatively good timing, ANSYS, the French National Agency for Food, Environmental and Occupational Health, has set up a new procedure to look at determining potential exposure and health impact of 37 different manufactured substances determined to have particles at the nanoscale present in food. And their different justification here is that they have 7 substances that are proven to exist within foodstuffs and 30 substances suspected of being contained within foodstuffs. So this is not intentionally added materials as such, and so you would not have a consistent presence across all batches. However, this is something that would be established to be found at some point in those food products. And so good examples of that would include infant milk, confectionery, and breakfast cereals, because of course these are quite highly processed products in the first place, and they're often quite complex. So ANSYS will undertake a study of the potential exposure and risk for consumers and help propose a methodology for assessing nano risk. So I think this is quite useful to look at the practical application of different methodologies into assessment of foodstuffs and nanomaterials. So we will keep everybody posted on that. And we will also provide you a link to the original document, which is in French, but it's not particularly difficult to understand. So we leave Europe and move to address Brexit. And as many people will be aware, the UK will come to the end of its transition period at the end of 2020. And very recently, the European Union published several documents that were Brexit preparedness guides. So the ones that are specifically useful for us are the Guide to Chemicals and the Guide to Biocides. They don't introduce anything particularly new. They restate what we already know to be legally required during and after the transition process, but it does focus the mind for those organisations both in the UK and outside that may be impacted by this. Some things will be impacted further by the outcome of any negotiations by the end of this year, particularly around data. However, these are sort of nailed on legal requirements here that you will have to look at. So where you have the chemicals regulation, the UK is developing a UK REACH version, which will be available later this year for consultation and will be fully operable by January the 1st, 2021. the particular points from the latest Brexit preparedness guides really point out the fact that you need to ensure that your registrations are within the EU rather than the UK. So this is very important for you to do. So whether you're a UK exporter or a non or a third country importer of materials, you need to make sure that you have EU representation. There's much the same method, much the same recommendations when you get to biocides as well. So you need to make sure that you have appointed a representative established within the European Union and notify ECHA. And NIA has ongoing work to support members with regard to preparing for the end of the transition period. So we are in contact with a number of UK government agencies. We're really pleased to see that they're really interactive. And so we hope very much to have a lot more information, particularly in the autumn, at how each of the different sectors will become clearer for nanomaterials. The UK has clearly stated that it will transition over the EU legislation into UK law. So the REACH equivalent will be very closely matched to the existing REACH. But of course, with nanomaterials and the recent updates of REACH to bring in nano-specific language and requirements, that's still a learning process for everybody concerned. So we're hoping to support organisations both in the EU and the UK to ensure that there is no great difference or no great difficulties between EU and UK nanoform guidance and requirements. Again, you'll be able to download both of these different guidances from the slides when I send them out to you today. We now finish on this side of the ocean and move across to the US, and we have two items to touch on here. Neither of these are particularly recent, but they are worth including because they are relevant. So we have a carbon nanotubes significant new use rule, or SNUR, from TSCA, and this allows manufacturers to provide more precise guidance to users of carbon nanotubes, which our members have told us is very helpful because they can now be more specific with their advice to clients. And you can find full information for that in the link here. The second one is the EPA has registered a new Nanosilver active ingredient as a materials preservative. And I include this here partly because, of course, Nanosilver is now very sexy with the COVID pandemic. And so we're expecting to see it used in a lot more applications, not only for short-term sanitization and PPE, but also long-term surface coatings to try and reduce viral load in our everyday lives. And what we have here is also an interesting example of the application of safe by design to ensure that the materials are both safely produced during manufacture and also their use. So they've talked about here the nanosilver would be embedded into plastic beads or pellets within a closed loop process so that there is no risk of contamination into the environment during manufacture. And of course, then those beads and pellets are also a minimal exposure for downstream users for integration into textiles such as fabrics. So this is a really interesting example of nanosilver becoming more widely used as a materials preservative. And we have several members active in nanosilver. So we hope very much that the high level of interest that they have received so far this year translates into very solid business development pathways. So now we take a step back upwards again from the US and the EU, and we look at more global aspects. So I'm really pleased to see that two new guidance documents have been published very recently that refer to nanomaterials. And in speaking with members, you have new regulatory frameworks and you have standards which you use to allow yourself to address those frameworks with confidence. And the guidance documents and the test guidelines are incredibly important to allow you to apply those standards appropriately. So previously, there's a lot of guidance documents and test guidelines which did not meet the needs of nanomaterials. And so we're very pleased to see, particularly through initiatives such as the Malta initiative, that more test guidelines and guidance documents are becoming appropriate for use with nanomaterials. And that has two big advantages. One is, of course, that companies themselves can be more confident in the information they can produce as part of their regulatory dossiers, but also it allows key service providers such as CROs to offer more test services that are appropriate for nanomaterials, because that is a really big bottleneck in terms of bringing a new material to market, is access to these sort of professionalized services that you need to do that. So the first guidance document that you have here is linked to testing of dissolution and dispersion stability. There's nothing here I can tell you that you can't read super easily out of the guidance document itself. But it's really looking at addressing the dissolution rate. It's looking at allowing you to assess the state of behavior, also the influence of different experimental conditions on performance of the methods, because as we know, methods for assessing nanomaterials can vary hugely in their outcome, even if applied in seemingly similar ways. It also addresses modifications or additions to the methods to support interpretation of test results. And you will be able to assess the full guidelines here. The second guidance document that we have here is around aquatic and sediment toxicological testing. So, of course, this can be a very challenging type of testing to do. And, of course, as with all nanomaterials testing, it's very expensive. So you really want to do it correctly the first time. So the guidance document that we have now is hoping to provide support for adapting existing test guideline methods to improve accuracy, repeatability, and reproducibility, and helping users to differentiate the difference between chemical toxicity versus biological effects that results from the physical effects of manufactured nanomaterials, which of course is an important differentiation to make. So again, that full guidance document is accessible now, and you'll be able to access it through the link at the bottom of my slide. This next topic is something I would like to improve. This is old. This is from November last year. However, it is quite an important point to think about today. Not because we have got carbon nanotubes now on the SIN list, but the type of language and terminology that has been used around it. And this is certainly leading to a position paper from NIA that I mentioned earlier. The language used in the addition of the SIN list for carbon nanotubes, it refers to them as nanomaterials, which means, of course, it has included all carbon nanotubes within this list, regardless of the individual characteristics of the carbon nanotubes. And this came to light as a discussion point in an earlier NIA webinar, where we were also looking at some of the other representation of nanomaterials from stakeholders, with the observatory being another example used, where very high level references to nanomaterials were being used to undermine confidence, shall we say, in all of the materials within that particular substance. And as we have now the revised REACH annexes, where manufacturers now have to have their nanoforms within clearly defined and clearly justified sets, we feel that this language is a little bit obsolete now, where you refer to something as a very generic nanomaterial. So we would like to recommend, and we'll be doing so in the position paper that we develop, that terminology from external stakeholders also reflects the advancing complexity of how nanoforms are presented and justified. So we would like to see, for example, just to use an example, if you are going to have carbon nanotubes on the SIN list, which characteristics would there be? Which sets of carbon nanotubes would you include on that? And why would you do that? Because as you know, there's immense diversity in carbon nanotubes. So some will be absolutely fine, others will be of higher concern in different scenarios. So we would really like to encourage policymakers and stakeholders to revise their terminology as well, linked to the use of the term nanoform rather than nanomaterials. So that's something that will give us lots of work to do later this year with members, and we look forward to sharing the results with you. This brings me to the last aspect of the agenda this afternoon as part of the open webinar, and that is the work that NIA is doing as part of some extremely well-skilled consortia in supporting the development of further regulatory clarity for nanomaterials and nanoforms. So I just want to cover the Nano Harmony project here. And I know we have a few of the partners involved in this webinar today. So this is a project that was funded by the European Commission as part of the wider Malta initiative, which is so called because it was developed up in Malta at the 2 Euro Nano forums ago, I think it was, in the Sunshine by the Sea, which is a really good place to develop up any new initiative. And this was really looking at the fastest way to support the development of nanomaterials more effectively to market is through addressing the test guidelines and guidance documents that support them. So the Malta initiative has resulted in several projects to target specific test guidelines and guidance documents, and Nano Harmony is one that has started quite recently. So it's looking at 8 different endpoints that have been identified as very relevant for nanomaterials, and it's developing tasks to enable the support of better test guidelines and guidance documents for these particular endpoints. So this project is quite new. It will run for another 2.5 years, and there are lots of ways for different organisations to become involved. And we, from NIA, have seen a significant interest from industrial participants for this because this is highly relevant to your own materials development. So there are lots of ways to be involved. I've already mentioned the webinar, which we will be holding jointly with the OECD in September. So we would recommend that you would come along to that and look at how test guidelines are developed, because it's a slow and rather painful process. And hopefully projects such as Nano Harmony can accelerate this quite significantly. Later on in the year, we will have an expert workshop online between November the 3rd and the 5th, looking at each of those endpoints, particularly to look at where the data gaps are and how we progress towards advanced test guidelines and guidance documents. You should also become a stakeholder of the project, so you can sign up to receive the newsletter and sort of in between consultations and invitations, because this will be a really good way for you to find out what is going on within these endpoints that are relevant to your own interests. So we've had a really good response from industry so far, and we would really like to expand this, particularly on a global scale, so that we can have a global approach to the sort of creating a more robust framework for nanomaterials development through to market. So that really brings me much more smoothly than I anticipated to the end of our slides for today. You're very lucky, because usually I can talk literally without stopping. But I would like to thank you all for taking part. I'm going to just check I haven't got any next slides. No, that's good. The recording of this will be converted to an MP4 and uploaded onto YouTube a bit later today. So I will contact everybody that attended and registered for this meeting with the full recording plus the slides that I have presented today. And at 4 o'clock Central European Summer Time, we will switch on the NIA member follow-up discussion period for this webinar. And so anybody interested in joining that should already have the information. Members that haven't looked at the information can just email me for a quick follow-up to get that information. And I look forward to seeing you back online at 4 o'clock. So thank you very much to everybody that took part in the webinar today. I hope that was useful. And I would invite any feedback that you have to follow up from this, and indeed future topics that you would like us to see us cover in our regulatory priority webinars. So take care, everybody, and I hope that you have a good summer holiday and a nice rest. So we will see you at the next meeting.